How many stories have you heard that have survived thousands of years? Probably not many. But one really good example is the Bible. Because the Bible's got a whole bunch of these really great stories. They're short, they're concise, they're deep. Some pretty crazy stuff. It will blow your mind. Now, there is one story in particular from the Bible that has always fascinated me. I think it's the most important one in the Bible, and it's the story of Cain and Abel. Because it illustrates so many different psychological factors about human beings and envy and disgust. And most importantly, betrayal. Betrayal is one of the most common themes in stories and movies and books and literature. We can't get enough of it because it fascinates us to no end. So in this episode, we are going to be exploring what might be the greatest betrayal in history. The Night of the Long Knives. Hello there, my friend. Welcome back to History for Thinkers, a show that brings history to life. I want to thank everyone over on Patreon for supporting the show and making it all possible. If you guys want exclusive content or a shout out like Matthew and Tomas over here, head on over to patreon.com/historyforthinkers. Now, let's get into the Night of the Long Knives. So everyone has their own way of learning and understanding things. The way that always works best for me is to start with a really broad surface overview of how things went down. And then I kind of, narrow it down to, some of the trends and forces, right? Some of the push and pull that was going into it, some of the detail a little bit later. So we're going to start with this very basic overview. What happened in the Night of the Long Knives? So the Nazis took power in 1933. And this event, the Night of the Long Knives, was basically one big purge of any dissenters of the Nazi Party within the party itself, because there were many, and within the government, and even some sections of society that were outside of the government. This was orchestrated by Hitler, Göring, and Himmler. Other people were involved, but this was pretty much the brains behind the entire operation. But the actual killing itself was done by the SS, which by this point had become very powerful. It was essentially a branch of the SA, which was a paramilitary organization that turned into this weird police force kind of thing, and this is the event that changed the entire dynamic. Because the SS goes from a small, technically a small branch of a paramilitary group, essentially bodyguards for Hitler, and he goes from that to the craziest, most powerful police force in Europe. And that was a very, very big change. So the justification for the Night of the Long Knives was that it was to prevent a coup. Now, who was going to be doing this coup? Really, the dissenters, right? People who just so happened to be able to battle with Hitler. People that could have their own political opinions. People that could oppose him and challenge his authority in the government. So some of these people were actually inside the Nazi Party themselves. They were very staunch supporters of Nazism, and they played a big role. One of these guys had been in the party as long as Hitler was. So, that's kind of why it was the Night of the Long Knives. It was a very big betrayal. And what happened as a result of everything? Hitler had complete control of the political party, the Nazi Party, and that party had complete control of the government. So, in effect, Hitler had basically control of all of German society. And now there was no internal dissent. The only opposition to Hitler at this point was outside of the party, outside of the government, and they could be dealt with, with the SS. So it was no problem dealing with any other opposition. So in order to understand some of what was going on, we need to get the context of this situation. Now, we're not going to go back that far, but we are going to start with how Hitler got control of the German government. So he essentially secured funding for the Nazi Party through corporate interest. This is essentially where he partnered with a whole bunch of big names and industrialists and capitalists and billionaires, or the equivalent at that time, and just a bunch of rich people, right? The guys who were what the Marxists would call the bourgeoisie, the factory owners. Because these were the guys who feared a communist revolution. After all, they were looking over there, one border to the east, and they were like, oh hey, Russia over there is kind of looking scary. They're itching for bringing revolution here. They want to end the bourgeoisie. They want to end capitalism. They want to abolish private property. And that's going to mean a lot of dead business owners. And these guys recognize that, so they pretty much teamed up with the most anti-communist people you can find, right? These Nazis. And this actually goes back much further than the 1930s or so. I mean, even early on in Hitler's career, he was securing funding and support through, basically old school elites, right? People that were the nobility, people that were business owners, people that were wealthy, right? But that's an entire topic for another time. But just understand, these guys were big supporters of the Nazis. So the Weimar government was not strong enough to prevent a communist revolution. It was very evident that they just couldn't do anything effectively, which is part of the reason that there was so much support for communists and Nazis. Because, really, everyone recognized that some kind of collapse, some kind of revolution was coming sooner or later. The best thing that you can do is pick your, lesser of two evils. Who do you hate more? Do you hate the communists more? Well, join the Nazis. Do you hate the Nazis more? Well, join the communists. And that is exactly what most people in German society did. Now, toward the beginning of the end, where Hitler has now seized control of the government in 1933, where he's effectively the chancellor, he has most power, he's beginning to pass some of these emergency decrees that give him totalitarian control. By this point, the Nazi Party is dead broke, right? You gotta think some crazy guy maxed out on all his credit cards. He's got that final eviction notice. He's about to be thrown out onto the streets because he's got no money left. Like, that is how poor they were. So Hitler finds all these German industrialists and promises to eliminate trade unions and communists. And that is essentially how he funds the Nazi Party going into his control in 1934. Because, you know what? If they didn't have enough money to last that year, maybe it wouldn't have happened. Maybe Hitler never gets complete control of the government. Maybe World War II never happens. And that is a big what if. So if you're into those alternate history things, that's a good topic right there, right? What if these German industrialists didn't fund Hitler's Nazi Party? Who knows what happens? But the industrialists were more than happy to secure some funding here. They raised 3 million Reichsmarks to secure Nazi power, which comes out to about 30 million US dollars today. So these guys were rich. They were protecting their own interests, and, well, they had to, get in bed with the devil, so to speak. And it was so prevalent, right? They had such an impact that a lot of these guys were charged at Nuremberg. I mean, that is how serious a role they played. Because not only did they, pull this little move, but it became a kind of a return on their investment. Because Hitler later on gave them a whole bunch of privileges and basically let them get rich as hell. There was a lot of rampant wealth inequality in the Third Reich. So that's enough context to understand where this entire situation is going. Now let's talk about the actual struggle for power. So this all centers around the SA. And the SA was a paramilitary organization that was basically originally a bunch of German mercenaries. So in the German countries, right, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, there is this very old tradition going back to I think the 17 or 1800s where they basically made war their livelihood. They would fight, they would, get paid by, just about anyone, right? I'll kill people if you pay me enough, right? That was essentially their business model, and it worked for a lot of them. It continued for, hundreds of years. And toward the end of World War I, most of this group was made up of embittered World War I veterans who opposed communism. So they all have this shared sense of, sacrifice. They fought long and hard in World War I. It was a tremendous, tremendous experience. Millions of these guys died. They saw their families die out. Just so much suffering. And because people in the military tend to lean right, they were staunchly anti-communist. And that gives you a good idea of who the SA was. So it's not a big surprise that they eventually got into bed with the Nazis. Now, again, they were not a specifically Nazi organization, although they gravitated toward the Nazis as time went on. But originally, the SA was just working with the Weimar government. They were simply trying to stop communism. That is all they wanted to do, stop a communist revolution. But they still functioned as an autonomous paramilitary organization. They had their own hierarchy, their own structures. They did what they wanted to do. And you weren't really going to be able to influence them so much because, it was kind of this almost a decentralized organization. Although it was very hierarchical within its own ranks. But, controlling that, it was very difficult. So Ernst Roehm, who was an old-time Nazi Party member, this is like an old school friend of Hitler. He was in the beer hall putsch back in the 20s. He was in prison with Hitler. So, this guy is an old school hardcore Nazi. He was around before it was cool. And he becomes the leader of the SA in 1930. And that's a very big deal. So when Roehm finally gets control of this thing, it basically turns into this police force. And he is ordered by Hermann Göring to take care of, quote, all enemies of the state. So he is essentially tasked with fighting any kind of opposition. The people who are not supportive of our regime, they're basically enemies and they gotta be killed. And this is really where this reign of terror begins on the German population. So here we're going to talk about something that popular history doesn't focus on very much. So this might be new to you. Now, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was a coalition of all these different ideologies and popular ideas at the time. And it just kind of took all the really popular stuff and blended it all together, right? Hitler recognized very early on that there were a lot of people that were staunchly nationalist. So he put nationalists in there. There were a lot of people who were very staunchly socialist. Put the word socialist in there. And he was able to play these different ideologies into the crowd in a way that he could attract all kinds of different people. People who would otherwise never be part of the same political party. Now, Hitler and most of the old school Nazi leadership, they were these, World War I veterans. They were very right-wing in the way that we would think about being right-wing. They were very authoritarian. They were ethno-nationalists. And they were very opposed to the left. Now, here's the thing though. There was a lot of opposition inside the Nazi Party from the socialist side of the National Socialist Party. There were a lot of people who were, you could almost think of them as leftists, right? Even by today's standards, these people were very much left-wing. But they were still Nazis, right? Interestingly enough, because again, Hitler just got all these people, he used all the right buzzwords and he somehow attracted all these different people from all these different political camps into this one political party. And that may have been good to get the ball rolling. But one of the problems is that, you now have all these people who fundamentally disagree on some pretty important stuff here, right? And these socialists inside the Nazi party, they had a lot of problems with how the party was running. So generally, these people all opposed capitalism, right? The unlimited accumulation of wealth, exploitation by the business owners, right? Factory owners, right? Things like that. That was pretty much the big thing that united the socialists inside of the Nazi party. And some of the prominent names were Roehm, the Strasser brothers, so Gregor and Otto Strasser, and there were many more, right? There were many more people inside the Nazi party that were just very socialistic in their outlook. Okay, my friend, I know we have to talk about one very important thing right here, and that is the difference between socialism and communism. So socialism, right, the definition is the social ownership of the means of production. In English, that basically means the people who work in the businesses should own them. So if you work in the factory, you should own the factory, right? Or be some kind of part owner. You should have some kind of stock in the factory. You should have like a good say in what is going on with that factory, right? And that is very different to communism, because communism is a branch of socialism that basically wants social ownership of the means of production, but it wants the government to own it all. So the government controls all the businesses, all the factories, everything. There is no private property anymore. And we can make the communistic government democratic, right? Everyone's got some kind of a vote. So in theory, everyone has some say in what goes on with all the private property that the government now owns. And at the time, communism was being started in Soviet Russia, and all the chaos that was going on there, right? I don't think I have to get into that here, but that is really the difference here. So you can be a socialist and not a communist. There is a very big wall between the two. Socialists, there are many other kinds of socialism, but being a socialist does not necessarily make you a communist. But if you are a communist, you are a branch of socialists. Which is why Nazis, people who hated communism, could be socialists. Alright, now that we understand the difference between socialism and communism, we can talk about Gregor Strasser's kind of approach to it. So he gave this speech to the Reichstag in 1925, and Gregor Strasser said, quote, "We National Socialists want the economic revolution involving the nationalization of the economy. We want, in place of an exploitative capitalist economic system, a real socialism, maintained not by a soulless Jewish materialist outlook, but by the believing, sacrificial, and unselfish old German community sentiment, community purpose, and economic feeling. We want the social revolution in order to bring about the national revolution." So what he's really saying here is that he is a socialist, right? This is what he wants. He does not want some business owner to own the factory, get rich off of other people's labor, while the people who work in the factory are starving, or they can't feed their kids, or they can't afford a decent lifestyle. Because let's not forget, this is still during that industrialization period. There are a lot of people in very miserable working conditions. And this gets us at the idea that so many people were socialists only because the early industrial capitalism was just so bad, right? It was bad. It was causing misery and despair for the majority of the population. The only people who wanted to keep things the same were the business owners. The only people. No one had to second guess that. It was just very bad. You have to imagine everyone being some version of a socialist because, right, the current free market capitalist system is screwing everyone, right? This is essentially what was going on during this time period. Not only in places like Russia and Germany, but also to an extent the US and the UK as well. But a little bit too much of a tangent. We can talk about that more in another episode. But the long and short of it is that Strasser, who is now this prominent socialist, was a prominent member of the Nazi Party. I mean, he was recognized, he was respected across the board by a lot of people, especially because, he acknowledged a lot of the shortcomings of the Nazi Party, right? Because they were ignoring a lot of these socialist ideas. Especially because he spoke for Hitler when Hitler was banned. So after Hitler got out of prison, he gave this really inflammatory speech, right? Really riling people up, and he got banned like a day later or something like that. And he had to ask Gregor Strasser to give speeches for him in the North and the West, because Berlin, and these other places, they did not want Hitler around. So Strasser became really popular in a lot of these places. Now, Strasser also published his own newspaper called the National Socialist, right, the National Socialist. And in this publication, he basically did what you would expect, right? He was still a party member, so he was still spreading Nazi propaganda. But there was much more of this socialist emphasis going into some of the writings and whatnot, right? He would talk a lot about exploitation of the working class and things like that, and then kind of put a Nazi spin on it. So, we need to help our German brothers in need, right? They're they're not able to secure their existence for their family, and it's, ruining the race, so on, that kind of line of reasoning. And it's actually kind of funny because this very left-wing Nazi newspaper was more prominent and more popular than a lot of the other Nazi propaganda, right? The future propaganda minister Goebbels actually got this newspaper banned, and it was eventually denounced by Hitler himself because it was just so popular. Because again, who was Hitler being funded by? He was being funded by the big business, by the rich people. The same rich people that were exploiting the working class. And Hitler was buddy-buddy with them now. So the Strasser brothers and Roehm and all these other, socialist Nazis were kind of a real thorn in the side here. I mean, they were causing some real conflict. Because Hitler couldn't turn around and screw over his financiers over here, right? He could not stop the business interests. So he basically ignored all the socialist ideas in the National Socialist program. So what happened here was the Strasser brothers, Otto and Gregor, they were forced to resign from office, right? Basically, resign or we're going to kill and exile you, which ended up happening anyway. And, that kind of sucked, because they represented a very popular movement inside the Nazi Party itself. Now, they had, by this point, already criticized Hitler for his failure to live up to the socialist promises. He got all these socialist-leaning people to vote and become members of the Nazi Party, including the Strasser brothers themselves, right? Don't forget, these guys were promised, right? We're going to have socialist policies. We're going to have, right, a good, lifestyle for the working class. People are going to be able to get by on their wages and, all these promises. Hitler was failing them. He was ignoring them. He was focusing on racial hatred and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and ramping up the military and, the things that Hitler did. So it was very frustrating. And, the most off-putting part has to be that a lot of these socialist ideas were actually part of the original 25-point program. All right, so we're going to look at just a few of these here to get an idea. So we got number 7 here, which reads, quote, "We demand that the state be charged first with providing the opportunity for a livelihood and way of life for the citizens, right? That sounds very much like a socialist idea, right? The government is responsible for making good economics for people to make a living. Got number 11 here. Quote, the abolition of unearned incomes, breaking of debt, slavery, right? So if you are not earning money with your hands, you shouldn't be earning money. Or maybe your mind, right? Maybe you're some kind of intellectual, but for most people, this means doing some kind of active work. The idea that you're going to own a house and you're going to rent it out to people, that's wrong. That should be abolished. And there are lots of other different things, right? Especially the big one for the Nazis was debt and interest, because they recognized that debt slavery was very popular with Jewish people, right? Especially because the Jews were prominent bankers during this time, right? And that is not an anti-Semitic thing to say, so a little background there. The Jews were basically forced out of most careers throughout European history, right? Anti-Semitism, pretty much always a thing in Europe. And, well, the only thing they were basically allowed to do was become bankers. So they provided this really necessary and important function for society because, well, the Christians, they weren't allowed to charge interest. So if you're not allowed to charge interest, you can't run a bank efficiently. You can't make a return on your investment. So you're kind of screwed. But if you're Jewish, right, you have no problem with charging interest. So all these Jews, they went into banking, and that is the reason that they were prominently featured in the banking industry. And the Nazis, well, they thought it was because Jews were evil or, whatever conspiracy theories they had about Jews. But yeah, so enough of that tangent. So then we've got number 15 over here. Quote, we demand an expansion on a large scale of old age welfare. So we should take care of our old people, not let them die in the street like animals. And then we got number 16 here. Quote, we demand the creation of a healthy middle class and its conservation. I mean, guys, look at some of these policies here. These are very socialistic policies, right? Caring for the working class, having to earn money with your hands. I mean, this is, not exactly the capitalist dream here. And these were the parts of the party program that Hitler and the other Nazi leadership completely ignored. Completely ignored the stuff, right? Imagine, right? You went up to these big business owners and told them that they had to work with their hands now, that they had to get a job in their own factory, right? You saying this to, someone that's like one of the top 10 richest people in the country. Not going to happen. Not going to happen, right? At least if there's anything that the big money guys can do about it. So, in response to the blatant hypocrisy and the bullshit, Otto Strasser created the Black Front. However, they never really achieved anything, right? So this Black Front was kind of basically what was left of the socialists after they had been forced to resign from power. So they had no influence, they couldn't really do anything, and they had a lot of infighting themselves. So now that we understand a lot of the politics behind the scenes of what was going on here, we can actually talk about the murders that took place during the Night of the Long Knives, because this was one big event. It's very crazy. I mean, I couldn't imagine having lived through this. I mean, the people that went through this, it must have been a very scary time. So one of the first things they did was assassinate all the conservative politicians, right? Kurt von Schleicher, Franz von Papen, Gustav von Kahr, all these old school conservative guys that were one of the reasons that the Nazis had a chance at all. Right? A lot of these guys were opposed to communism. They let the Nazis kind of come in. They worked with the Nazis and, well, again, stabbed in the back. Just like Ernst Roehm, just like the Strasser brothers. I mean, all these people stabbed in the back, betrayed by the Nazis. They even murdered leadership in the Catholic Center Party. And the most shocking part here right? The most shocking part is that the Catholics, or at least the people in the Catholic Center Party, right? So people that are Catholic, that are in this political party, they helped the Nazis, right? They helped pass some of these emergency decrees. They helped, I think, with the Enabling Act, right? All these things that gave Hitler more power, more control, took away civil liberties. And it didn't even matter. It didn't even matter because a lot of their leaders got killed in the end. They got murdered by the Nazis that they helped. And many of the SA leaders, they died saying Hail Hitler. Right? A lot of these guys were, you can almost think about it like they were shot in the back of the head. I mean, no one saw this coming. I mean, it was such a, you have to think, something that gets a title like The Night of the Long Knives. I mean, which I don't think it is an exaggeration to say this was the greatest betrayal in history. I mean, all these different people. I mean, the conservatives, the Catholics, the SA guys. I mean, these are guys who have been fighting for Hitler. Ardent, hardcore, fanatic Nazis. They died saying Hail Hitler. Killed by, the directions of Hitler himself. So they actually captured Roehm, who was really the one big threat by this point. Because again, he was a socialist. He still had prominence inside the party. So they brought him to a prison cell and they basically sat him down with a gun. And they said, listen, you're going to kill yourself. We're going to give you 10 minutes. We're going to walk away. We don't hear a gunshot. We're going to come here. We're going to kill you. So Roehm replied, quote, if I am to be killed, let Adolf do it himself. Because there was just no more, you couldn't get more of a betrayal than what was going on here. I mean, this is someone who was in the beer hall putsch. This is someone who was in prison with Hitler in the 1920s. I mean, all these years of sacrifice and work and dedication and loyalty. And now, the party that he worked so hard to fight for and to bring to power was going to order his death, was going to slaughter him, discard him. That, you know what? I don't think Ernst Roehm was a good person, but I mean, that is just one of the saddest fates I've ever heard. Saddest fates. So, after he was dead, the SA was basically neutered. The SA was not even a thing after this point. Didn't really matter. Had no power. The SS became its own thing, and that went on to become the crazy police force that controlled all of Europe. I mean, they just terrorized everyone, destroyed everything, They were the ones primarily responsible for the Holocaust and killing all the civilians. And on top of all of this betrayal, the Nazis looked to the Strasser brothers. They kill one of them. They kill Gregor right off the bat. They couldn't kill Otto. And Otto Strasser goes into exile. He starts out in Czechoslovakia, but eventually makes his way to Canada. And he's just never the same after that. He actually goes back to Germany after World War II to try to revive Nazism, right? Ironically enough. So, that guy just never lost the vision, but he's never going to really matter after this point in history. I mean, he was basically done with when the Nazis betrayed him. So, all the opposition to the far right Nazi party, right? Inside the Nazi party itself, right? The Hitlers, the Goebbels, the Rosenbergs, the Himmlers, those guys have complete control now. They all agree on like 98% of issues. And things are solidified. Things are completely solidified by now. And Albert Speer, who was actually one of the less crazy people inside of the Third Reich, he was an architect. He observed, quote, the right, represented by the president, the minister of justice, and the generals, lined up behind Hitler. The strong left wing of the party, represented chiefly by the SA, was eliminated. So there is no more opposition. Hitler and his goons have complete control of the entire party, of the entire government, and they're going to try to get control of the entire world, too. So the left-wing ideas are dead, and they're not going to make a comeback until after World War II. And just so we understand how shocking the Night of the Long Knives was, right, we have to look at some of the way the world reacted. So Ernst Hans Stengel was another one of these old school, hardcore Nazi party members, back from the old days. And he was actually part American. He spoke English. He was, he went to Harvard. He was a really prominent guy. And he was actually back in America when all this went down. There were rumors that he may have been on the list himself, because he was one of the less crazy people in the Nazi party. And he found out in a newspaper, and he's in America. He's going to this Harvard reunion, trying to make a political connection with FDR for Hitler. And he's over in the US now, and he's like, oh my God, they had they purged half of, all the people in the government and all these dissenters and, people in their own party, and it just looked really bad. So he's in the US and he's in a really awkward position because everyone's looking to him now and saying, what's going on? And Hans Stengel is just sitting there shrugging his shoulders like, I didn't even know about this. He found out in the newspaper, for crying out loud, man. That's just crazy. Crazy stuff. And there was a big international backlash, right? Because, when people blatantly murder political dissenters in their own country, right, you always have to worry about that. Always have to worry about that. But little did the international stage know how bad things would really get. Because, remember, this is still almost a decade before World War II even breaks out. So this is going to go on, and there aren't going to be any real consequences for the Nazis. They basically get away with it. They commit this big purge, kill all their enemies, and that's it. Not even really a slap on the wrist. And what's the most shocking part of this all is that they actually had so much support from the military. Even President Hindenburg, right, the old school, the World War I general, who was loved and respected by nearly everyone in German society. Even he is given a thumbs up from the sidelines. So, he's on board, and a lot of the military's on board, and, well, for the most part, the people in Germany who saw this for what it was, they knew that there was no longer any opportunity to express opposition. It was, what was done, and they are where they are now. There's no going back. No going back after this. Even the former Kaiser of the German Empire, Wilhelm II, even he was freaking out. This is actually a picture of him with his family in exile in the Netherlands. And he's watching from afar, in horror, as the Nazis, they just take control of everything. And he writes, quote, "We have ceased to live under the rule of law, and everyone must be prepared for the possibility that the Nazis will push their way in and put them up against the wall." And Hitler has no problem with doing just that. And in response to all the backlash, Hitler addresses the Reichstag and says, quote, "If anyone reproaches me and asks why I did not resort to the regular courts of justice, then all I can say is this. In this hour, I was responsible for the fate of the German people, and thereby I became the supreme judge of the German people. I gave the order to shoot the ringleaders in this treason, and I further gave the order to cauterize down to the raw flesh the ulcers of this poisoning of the wells in our domestic life. Let the nation know that its existence, which depends on its internal order and security, cannot be threatened with impunity by anyone. And let it be known for all time to come that if anyone raises his hand to strike this state, then certain death is his lot. Oppose my government, and I will kill you, and I will get away with it. And there's nothing you can do to stop me." Thank you so much for watching all the way through. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you guys want exclusive content or a shout out at the start of every episode, make sure to head on over to the Patreon page for more information on how to get just that. This has been Michael from History for Thinkers, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.